Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast, episode 55.
Welcome to the Out of Order Podcast, your window into the firearms community, exploring those shaping the future of our rights and protecting our lifestyle, laws, legal cases, activism, and self-defense in a candid and honest podcast for our brothers and sisters in arms. Here's your host, James Kalita.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 55 of the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. Today's sponsor is the Out of Order Gun Rights Podcast. We're starting a new program with Patreon where supporters that contribute $5 or more per month will get exclusive access to our secret Facebook group for Out of Order Podcast listeners and also a personalized thank you message on the show. So head over to outoforderjameskalita.com. Today's show notes page is 55, so outoforderjameskalita.com/55. But there's a link to become a Patreon supporter on any of the episode pages. All right, so today's guest is Dr. Stephen P. Halbrook. He is an attorney, author, Second Amendment advocate. He has written several books and many articles on gun rights, and what was really interesting to me about this is so many of the quotes and the ideas that we talk about, about the origins of the Second Amendment, about the effects of gun control, about how gun control leads to confiscation. Dr. Halbrook has documented all of these in book form and has really done an excellent job of proving what a lot of us knew. And now, here's Dr. Halbrook.
Stephen Halbrook, welcome to the show.
Glad to be on the show, James. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. So, Stephen, you just recently published a book, Gun Control in Nazi-Occupied France. Would you tell us a little about that?
Well, this book is kind of a sequel to one I did 5 years ago, a book called Gun Control in the Third Reich, Disarming the Jews and Enemies of the State. That book concerned how the Nazi tyranny disarmed domestic enemies, the political opponents, the Jews, before World War II started. This new book, Gun Control in Nazi-Occupied France, is what happened in a typical occupied country. Once Germany launched World War II, September 1, 1939, it was the same story in every country. France was a good typical example, and that's the one that I wrote this book about. And it has to do with the fact that in these European countries generally, there were pre-war restrictions. In France, the Prime Minister, Pierre Laval, in 1935, decreed firearm registration. And it was part of a policy of repression, frankly. The government thought the people they were getting too unruly. There had been a major demonstration in 1934, which actually resulted in the loss of numerous civilian lives and one police officer life. And so gun control was the way to solve the country's problems, violence in the streets and all that. Gun control and also increasing the size of the police force and also making it difficult to have public demonstrations and to assemble. And so what could go wrong? They passed firearm registration. Well, in 1940, Germany launched the Blitzkrieg, in which it defeated France in just a number of weeks. And every place where the German occupation army appeared, they put up posters. I've got pictures of these posters in the book. Saying that you have to turn in your guns in 24 hours or you're subject to the death penalty. Now, how could it not be a better world for gun control in the sense that here you had the French police had the registration records, Germany decreed the death penalty if you had a gun, and the peace treaty, the armistice, provided that the French police would work for the Germans. In other words, the French government totally would be at the behest of the occupation authorities. And so they had the records of gun owners. There was a death penalty potentially, and and the ones with the records were going to enforce the decree on behalf of the Germans. So the occupation starts. It was not too restrictive of an occupation at first, but then when they would catch gun owners, sometimes they would give them imprisonment, sometimes they would shoot them, and they would announce the person's name in the newspaper whenever you had a transgression that they executed you for, whether it was like distributing anti-Nazi propaganda, like leaflets, maybe even insulting a German officer. You could get varying degrees of punishment, including the death penalty. And when they shot you for that, they would put your name in the paper. They thought that would dissuade other people from committing the same offenses. So the book goes through these regular German reports of gun seizures. A lot of guns were turned in, a lot were not turned in. And in fact, at the end of the war, there was a estimate that only about a fifth of the hunting guns were turned in. There was a reason for that. Hunting guns had been exempt from the registration decree back in 1935. And so a lot of people buried their guns, they hid them, they wanted to save them for when the day would come to strike back, to struggle against the Nazis. And there was such a disobedience to the decree. One of the reports submitted by the German officer to the head, the general staff in Paris, was that the height of criminality of the French people turn in their guns. And so now and then the Germans would decree an amnesty where they would say, well, if you turn in your guns for the next 2 weeks, we won't shoot you for it. And they debated that among themselves, though, because some of them said, well, how can we do this when we just executed people the last few days for the same thing? But it would come about, and some more would get turned in, and then others would not get turned in. And all in all, the efforts were really not appreciated by the German commanders. They thought that these French just aren't turning them in the way they should. So then they announced what they called the Night and Fog Decree, which meant that they would no longer publish the names of people who they were going to deport or to execute for whatever the offense was, including gun ownership. The person would simply disappear, and nobody would happen to them, and they thought that would create more fear among the people than publishing the names. But gradually, the French resistance, in the meantime, was getting started. They were conducting surveillance activities and sending the information to the Allies. They were sabotaging railroads, exploding trucks, things like that. And finally, D-Day comes along, and the French resistance was a lot better organized by then. And they never had enough arms. They were all short of arms, always trying to get more arms. That was their biggest problem. But nonetheless, they provided immensely important services to the Allies when D-Day came, because they not only gave a lot of intelligence information, but they themselves started taking part in armed attacks against the Germans, especially in the French Alps. And so you had somewhat of a diversion of French forces. And so that was June of 1944. And when August comes along, the Allies had made enough progress that in the meantime, in Paris, the civilians in the French underground started their own rebellion there. And there was street fighting. And you see, there's a lot of photographs from them then, and you see pictures of civilians with civilian-type firearms and also military firearms that they had been able to either hide when France had been defeated originally or they captured from Germans. And so there was street fighting there, and finally the Allies made their way to Paris, the Allied armies, and Paris was liberated. And so, and by the way, in the meantime, Pierre Laval, who had decreed gun registration back in 1935, he became the chief collaborator of the Nazis, helping them to exploit the country economically, conscripting labor forces to go to Germany and work, and so because he became prime minister again under the Nazis, and so he was tried for basically treason against the country, and he himself was taken to one of the same prisons where they used to execute French people for resisting the Germans or for merely being gun owners, and then he himself was executed there. So the book is history. It's all documented based on French and German archives. Gun control is a divisive topic in the United States now, as it has been for many years. And the book, I think, gives you a good reminder to be careful what you wish for. History doesn't always repeat itself, but it does sometimes. And I think the lesson here is that gun registration, which today is promoted under the slogan universal background checks, for example, that would never be effective without registration. There's a Department of Justice study saying exactly that, and so it's a good history lesson for youngsters who we started the movement skip school because there was a failure of law enforcement, a failure of government in the school in Florida, in Parkland, and so why don't we go after gun ownership and NRA and all that? And the fact is that they should be studying history and seeing what gun control can really do.
And in your book, you talk about a lot of things that I hear other gun owners mention, and I think they take it for granted. Could you? I mean, I'm looking at your footnotes. Could you talk a little about what the process was like to gather and document all of this information?
It actually was a project that took me 20 years. I've also written books on the Second Amendment. I litigate cases on gun issues, but I spent a lot of time in archives in Germany and in France, and I also had experts in those countries who really know these records, and they helped to assemble copies of many, many records that it took a long time. It took years to go through them all. I have file cabinets full of these Xeroxes mostly. A lot of this research was before these kind of records could be scanned very easily. And these are records going back to the pre-war time in France. And then the most important group of records really was the German occupation records. And those are at the Bundesarchiv, the German military archive in Freiburg, Germany. And I spent time there, and I had an archive specialist help me gather those records. And so they would do monthly reports. The Germans would do monthly reports. They would submit to the German High Command. Otto von Stufnagel was his name. And they would report all the violations by the French, including gun possession and passing out anti-German leaflets of the whole works. So there were those records, and then we also found in French archives records of where the French police would have registration records, and they would check on gun owners who had not turned in their guns. And but I tell you what, a very unique source of information for the book was I did a questionnaire that I sent to members of the French resistance who were still alive at the time. This was in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And I sent a questionnaire, and I asked them about gun ownership and did your family hide guns, or did they keep them, or did they turn them in? What did they do? And so the book has a very unique window there of what some of the members of the resistance had to say later on. I got the list of resistance organizations, people who were still alive when I was in Paris in the Museum of the Resistance, and we sent the questionnaire to all the major groups, and we got a number back of answers and responses. And so we have a lot of original records in the book, and we also have the answers to these questionnaires where basically they were saying, yeah, my family, we hid the guns, we weren't turning in anything, other people did turn them in, and in any event, there's a lot of unique information in the book. We really see closely on the inside how an occupation army would really operate, and keep in mind that gun control is an absolute necessity for any kind of occupation. And I think that it's telling in terms of the way some of the proposals that are made today and some of the laws that are passed in places like California and New York. I think gun owners feel like they're virtually an occupied country. They're not trusted, and you get these terribly heavy penalties for mere possession of a gun or just a magazine.
And the surveys were really incredible to read. did you get to have more communication with the folks who sent the surveys back, or did you get to talk to any of them live? Or
most of them, I had a French lady help me. We translated our questionnaire into French, of course, and sent it. The responses were in French, and there were some of them that expanded on the questions pretty significantly. Some of them had written books on their experiences, and I got the benefit of some of those, and there was some extra communication. Most of them, it was a one-shot thing where they simply sent us the responses, but they were worth their weight in gold in the sense that, first of all, no historians ever tackled this topic for some reason. You've got books, an infinite number of books, it seems like, on World War II, and none of the authors, none of the historians have ever covered this topic. And to be able to get actually some things out of the words out of the mouths of those who actually were participants in all of this was really a gold mine for me.
And was there anything during your research that really surprised you weren't expecting?
Well, it's always difficult whenever there's a gun ban to know with any certainty at all how many were turned in and not turned in. And also when registration gets passed, it's always difficult to estimate what percent of the population did not register. Because I think we have the phenomenon here in the U.S. that when California required registration of rifles in 1989, the rifles they pejoratively called assault weapons estimate are that a fairly low percentage were registered, and that's been the same phenomenon elsewhere. But it's very difficult to find that out. But what was surprising was there's a hunting association in France. It's been there. I think it's been in existence 150 years or more. But during the war, they tried to represent the interests of their members, and they had a monthly magazine. And when the war ended, they did the estimate that I quoted a few minutes ago, that about only 1 in 5 of the hunting guns had been turned in pursuant to these decrees. And that's pretty telling. Here you have the death penalty being threatened for not turning in your guns. And a lot of people didn't comply. Maybe the majority didn't comply.
Right, and reading some of the surveys, it seems like a lot of people would turn in the oldest, least desirable gun and then hide the rest. Yeah.
That's correct. So, sort of the same as the so-called gun buybacks today. You get a lot of junk turned in, and they kept the best stuff for themselves. One other aspect that that is covered in the book, maybe not in as major way as the registration issue, is the fact that before the war, the French government had also banned from civilian possession what they called military-style firearms. They defined them primarily as rifles and handguns that fired military cartridges. And so you could own lower-powered rifles and pistols, but not ones that were considered to be of a military character. And so that also, when the resistance tried to get started, it was already hard enough based on the gun seizures and these pre-war restrictions to accumulate arms for resistance activities. And keep in mind, when I say resistance activities, I don't mean armed attacks against the Germans. That would only come later when the Allied armies came to France. You had to protect yourself. The Gestapo, if you were in an underground organization, the Gestapo was after you. And they would capture people and torture them. And so they had a cell-type network, so each person wouldn't know too much information, or wouldn't know the identities of too many other people. So that was quite a phenomenon in terms of course, they were executing not only people actively in the resistance, but also a typical farmer who didn't turn in his gun. I mean, all of that was going on.
So you, in addition to writing, you said you litigate a lot of things, and you won 3 Supreme Court cases. Would you like to tell us about those?
Well, I've been involved in more than 3, but I personally argued. One of them, the first one was a case called Thompson Center Arms versus United States, and it had to do with a National Firearms Act issue that we prevailed on. And the second case was the Sheriff J. Prince versus United States, in which the Brady Act, when it first passed about background checks, it was requiring local police and sheriffs to do background checks on behalf of the federal government. The Supreme Court invalidated that, held it unconstitutional 5-4 on the basis that states and localities don't work for the feds. I mean, they have their own mandates, but they weren't hired by the feds to do anything. They didn't answer to them, and you couldn't just give out commands like that. So it was a decision by the Supreme Court upholding the principles of federalism. And then the third case I argued had to do with the right to jury trial on gun cases. We won that one 9-0. And that was a case arising out of the Waco tragedy back in the 90s. But the Supreme Court has also finally got around, as you know, in 2008 to resolving the meaning of the Second Amendment in the Heller versus D.C. case. And in that case, I represented the majority of members of both houses of Congress, the Senate and the House, in an amicus, a friend of the court brief. And then 2 years later, in 2010, in the McDonald case, I represented the NRA in challenging Chicago's handgun ban, and we prevailed in that case as well.
Wow. And so at what point did you decide you wanted to focus on firearms law? Was that your intent from the time that you went into school, or did something happen that pushed you in that direction?
Well, I had an academic background. I started life I had a PhD in philosophy before I went to law school, and so I was researching the gun issue for a long time since I was an undergraduate in college. And so it was always my intent to try to do work on Second Amendment issues. So I've written a book called The Founder's Second Amendment and 2 or 3 other books on Second Amendment issues. And so, that goes back a long time. I've been in practice for 40 years, and that's been the focus of my practice.
And what's next for you? Any new books that you're working on or have been working on? Because you tend to work on these for a while, it seems like.
Yeah. Well, to accumulate all this archival information and translate it and everything, I mean, that's a phenomenal job, very time-consuming. What I'm trying to do now, the prior book that I did on German gun control had to do with, as I said, gun control in the Third Reich, and so I did a lot of work on getting the original sources back together so that could be translated back into other languages. And so that book now has been published in German, French, and Portuguese. And so the new book, Gun Control in Nazi-Occupied France, I'm working on getting all the original documents back in order in the original languages, French and German, to hopefully get that book out in those other languages as well.
So when you're working with researchers in other countries, do you find they share your passion for gun rights, or are they or are their views more consistent with the laws in their country?
Well, I really didn't inquire into their views, and they were very professional. Particularly the one there was one in Germany that was the most helpful of all. We never discussed it. You know, I said, here's what I want, here's the research that I want you to do, and here's how I want you to help me, and then did a wonderful job. And then in France, I guess the main researcher that I worked with was in favor of a more liberal gun law, one closer to what we have in the United States. But in any event, the research is the research. You go to the archives and you find what you find, and that's what you analyze and report on. So, you know, the researchers I worked with were just very professional, and you know, they would do other topics as well. So it was not a question of, you know, stacking the deck or using research that supported one view or another.
Sure. Well, Mr. Halbrook, I thank you very much for being on the show. Any parting words you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I have a website, stephenhalbrook.com, stephenhalbrook.com, and you can get information on the other books and other topics from that website, also a number of articles. And, you know, the book Gun Control in Nazioccupied France, you can just Google that title and my name, Stephen Halbrook, and nowadays you can get a book about anywhere. It's not limited to brick and mortar stores like when I grew up, so it's very easy to order books nowadays. You can get it from Amazon or anywhere you want to get it.
Very true. Any plans for audiobook versions of these in the future?
I'm not sure. I'm embarrassed to say that the other book that I mentioned, Gun Control in the Third Reich, that might actually be an audiobook, but I can't remember. It's not something I keep track of too well. I write the books and then I move on to the next project. And so I know some of my books are out in audio book form. I did a book called That Every Man Be Armed. That was my first book back in the 80s, and some of the others as well. I've done a couple of books on the Swiss experience in World War II. One of them called Target Switzerland, the other called The Swiss and the Nazis. And that's another story altogether of how this little country incredibly was able to dissuade an invasion by its Alps and its armed citizenry. But that's another topic.
Well, I thank you thank you again for being on the show, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay, thank you for having me, James. Glad to be here. Take care.
You too.
Thanks for tuning in to episode 55 of the Out of Order Gun Rights podcast. Show notes page for today's episode is outoforderjameskalita.com/55. And as you guys know, I reserve this spot for grassroots and not-for-profit organizations that are having events, and I wanted to let you guys know that on September 9th, the Lebanon Valley Sportsmen's Association is having a Walk Through the Woods pistol shoot. So you'll find a link to that on the show notes page, outoforderjameskalita.com/55. And if you know of a local grassroots or not-for-profit organization that helps defend the Second Amendment or teaches folks to shoot, send me a message and we'll get them a spot on the show. Out of Order, James Kalita. We'll see you next time.